Loving your child isn't about shielding or beating, a deep dive into American parenting paradigms. In American culture, the debate over discipline versus nurturing has persisted for centuries, shaping generations and influencing the very fabric of family life. While the old adage, "spare the rod, spoil the child," has echoed through time, modern research and shifting societal values have challenged its merit. I've grown increasingly sensitive to a haunting reality. Genuine love for a child can't be measured by how stringently you punish them, nor by how much you shelter them from the world. The essence of parenting in America, especially today, lies in an intricate balance between freedom and boundaries, compassion and structure, conversation and correction. What does it mean to love a child in a land celebrated for its individualism, innovation, and fierce emphasis on rights? For many American parents, love is teaching children to navigate a world bursting with opportunity, yet fraught with pitfalls. It's not about removing every obstacle or delivering swift punishment for every misstep. Instead, it's about preparing them to fall, equipping them to rise, and fostering resilience without eroding empathy. Historically, a hardline approach, sometimes physical, often authoritarian, dominated parenting, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Parents wielded both the metaphorical and literal rod, believing that discipline bred character and that too much coddling bred weakness. Yet, as American psychology and child development theory entered the mainstream in the post-war era, a tidal wave of change swept the parenting landscape. Figures like Dr. Benjamin Spock promoted gentle guidance and understanding, challenging the assumption that corporal punishment or harsh criticism were compatible with genuine love. Suddenly, the notion that real love is tough love faced a formidable challenger: the belief that open communication, validation, and trust nurtured stronger, healthier adults. But here's my quandary as an observer and someday parent. When does protection stifle growth? When does discipline cross over into cruelty? Loving a child means making hard choices, sometimes holding their hand, sometimes letting it go. It means creating a home where children feel safe, sharing their fears, but also responsible for their actions. The challenge is ongoing, especially as American families contend with new dilemmas: technology addiction, mental health struggles, and a world more interconnected but less certain than ever before. From bustling city apartments to rural heartland homes, American parents today wrestle with guilt over being too strict or too lenient. One friend of mine grew up in a home where backtalk earned a week of silent treatment, while another received timeouts and heartfelt explanations. Both carry scars, both found strengths too. The modern consensus, as far as I can discern, is that loving your child is less about shielding them from every blow or meting out every consequence. It's about accepting mistakes, yours and theirs. It's about modeling the values you hope to see reflect back in them: dignity, accountability, kindness, courage to apologize, and willingness to forgive. Ultimately, loving your child in America isn't a static doctrine, it's a living conversation, ever evolving and shaped by an unfolding understanding of what it means to raise a human being. We don't love our children by keeping them in bubble wrap or by breaking their spirit with the rod. We love them by guiding, correcting, listening, and, at times, letting them find their own way, just as American parents have done in myriad forms for generations. The American proverb, "spare the rod, spoil the child," is one of those iconic phrases that has echoed for generations within families, churches, and schools across the United States. Its roots dig deep into old-world thinking with biblical undertones, yet it somehow took on an almost uniquely American flavor, both celebrated and at times weaponized. This saying was more than simple advice. It was a cultural mandate passed down by parents who believed that strict discipline, often physical, shaped not only character, but also destiny. The rod wasn't just a branch or switch used for spanking, it became a symbol of parental authority, moral duty, and even love, all wrapped together in a single stinging lesson. In reality, though, applying this proverb was never as straightforward as its wording suggests. Across the sprawling, diverse landscape of the U.S., parents interpreted the phrase based on regional traditions, ethnic backgrounds, religious beliefs, and personal experience. For some, it meant a measured approach to discipline, structure with compassion, firmness without cruelty. For others, unfortunately, it justified heavy-handedness, with physical punishment doled out in the name of virtue. The line between correction and abuse could blur frighteningly fast, especially in communities where questioning this wisdom was seen as rebellion against both tradition and faith. Throughout much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, "Spare the rod, spoil the child," was cited not only in the privacy of the home, but also in schoolhouses, Sunday sermons, and public debates. Teachers wielded paddles, parents employed belts or switches, and most everyone agreed that to let a child go undisciplined was a moral failing. Yet even as the words were spoken, there were always those who quietly resisted, mothers, grandmothers, and sometimes fathers who feared that too much harshness destroyed the very bond they hoped to preserve. Over time, as psychology advanced, and new studies emerged about childhood trauma, the cracks in this old proverb began to show. By mid-20th century, a growing chorus of voices, doctors, educators, and even some churches, began to re-examine the wisdom behind the rod. Questions arose. Was it really love, or was it control? Did it teach resilience, or did it breed fear and secrecy? While the phrase still surfaces in conversations about discipline, modern parenting in America is gradually moving away from its literal interpretation. Nowadays, parents are far more likely to seek a balance between guidance and empathy, and to explore alternative forms of discipline that honor both the child's dignity and their need for boundaries. Yet, even today, the shadow of "spare the rod, spoil the child" lingers, a reminder of how deeply ingrained beliefs can shape not only individual families but entire societies. A childhood with nowhere to run. In the shadowed corners of 19th century American life, the idea of childhood was often a privilege, not a guarantee. For Herman Merritt, born in 1861 in the remote New Hampshire town of Kim Mountain, the concept of sanctuary was wholly foreign. His earliest memories weren't of playful laughter or gentle bedtime stories, but of a home ruled by the echo of his father's voice, relentless, unwavering, laced with the cold certainty of scriptural discipline. Herman's father, a man deeply obsessed with strict biblical interpretation, saw parental love interwoven with severity, each blow of the rod, every shouted rebuke, a lesson wrapped in the language of salvation. There was no refuge from his watchful presence, no hideout in which to catch one's breath, no warm embrace to offset the sting of punishment. Imagine a rambling farmhouse surrounded by harsh New England weather, winter's ice cutting through thin window panes, summers just barely warm enough for barefoot escapes into the woods. Yet, even the woods offered little solace. Inside, Herman's mother, worn down by years of silence and submission, kept a careful distance, her eyes casting toward her son in moments of quiet worry, yet her words always choked back before they could offer comfort. Each day blurred into the next, a monotonous cycle of school recitations, farm chores, random acts of cruelty disguised as discipline, and the relentless expectation that one day Herman would grow into the righteous, unwavering man his father demanded. But what does that do to a child's mind and soul? Every slammed door, every sharp word, every beating endured not for the sake of learning, but as a demonstration of control, etched invisible scars that ran deeper than flesh. Herman grew up knowing nothing of safety, only the persistent ache of not being welcome in his own home unless he conformed entirely. His world became a series of obstacles, each more isolating than the last. Friendships were hard-won and quickly lost to suspicion. Joy was muffled by the ever-present threat of reprimand. At times Herman wondered if other families were the same, if all fathers loved with such cruelty, if mothers loved from behind locked doors. In moments when he allowed himself to observe the outside world, he glimpsed neighbors with laughter spilling from their porches, fathers tossing baseballs instead of accusations, mothers kneeling to mend scrapes and tie laces. These rare sights stoked an inarticulate yearning, and a growing resentment at the fate handed down to him by birth. Ultimately, Herman's childhood could be summed up in one persistent feeling: entrapment. There was nowhere to hide, no shelter to which he could escape the violence disguised as virtue. The only options were compliance or silent rebellion, and neither ever led to true peace. In the cold, watchful house at Kim Mountain, a boy lost his childhood long before he ever had the chance to find it. In the rolling hills of New Hampshire, nestled among dense forests and windswept fields, there lay the small, almost forgotten town of Kim Mountain. Life here moved at a glacial pace, wood smoke curling from the brick chimneys, church bells echoing through the crisp morning air. The pulse of the town dictated not by machines or markets, but by the changing seasons and the relentless cycle of harvest and hardship. It was here, in the early 1860s, that Herman Merritt was born into a world defined by tradition, suspicion, and a peculiar kind of stoic endurance. The townsfolk were a hard-handed, weather-worn people, descendants of Puritans and pioneers whose laughter came in short supply, and whose judgments, once cast, were nearly impossible to reverse. Outsiders viewed Kim Mountain as quaint, even picturesque, but to those who called it home, it was a closed circle, one in which everyone knew each other's business, and secrets clung to the frosty air like mist. Herman's family possessed neither wealth nor titles, but they clung fiercely to respectability, propped up by ferocious adherence to faith and routine labor. His father, John Merritt, was as much a fixture in the town as the ancient oaks lining Main Street. He taught at the Sunday school, marshaled the congregation during sermons, and ruled his house with the iron certainty of biblical literalism. Every morning began with the same rituals: prayers whispered before breakfast, scripture readings laced with a warning glare, and the ever-present knowledge that the rod could fall at the slightest sign of defiance. Herman's mother, a woman worn thin by years of obedience and quiet anxiety, moved through their home like a restless ghost, present but never truly seen or heard, her true feelings locked away beneath starched aprons and careful silences. The Marais house, set just off the dusty main road, was overflowing with the trappings of piety: a battered, leather-bound Bible on every table, framed verses above every door, and candles left burning on stormy nights to keep back the darkness. A phrase Herman would come to understand had less to do with weather than with the fears his parents harbored within themselves. For a sensitive, sharp-witted boy like Herman, Kim Mountain sometimes felt less like a safe haven and more like a beautifully disguised trap, one where every neighbor's friendly nod could conceal a world of private grief, and where the line between virtue and violence proved dangerously thin. The death of a close friend is always a milestone in anyone's childhood, but for Herman, it was transformative in the most tragic sense. This pivotal moment wasn't just a memory to be folded away in the attic of adolescence. It was a seismic event that violently shook the foundation of his already fragile world. It happened one icy November afternoon after school, when the gray New Hampshire sky pressed low on Kim Mountain, making the small town feel more isolated than ever. Herman and Tom, as inseparable as two shadows, had slipped away from the watchful eyes of their parents for a rare moment of unguided exploration. Being in their early teens, the boundaries set by adults, where to go, what to touch, how to behave, felt suffocating and arbitrary. They craved spaces that belonged to them alone, away from fathers who barked orders, and mothers haunted by silent worry. There was an old, dilapidated building on the edge of town, a relic of Kim Mountain's long-faded prosperity. Its windows were missing panes, its floorboards rotted and groaning with every wind that passed through the frame. Local children, fueled by dares and legend, called it the Phantom House. The place was strictly off-limits, but the forbidden nature only made it more attractive. Herman and Tom didn't need to say much. They just exchanged a glance and darted across the field, hearts pounding in anticipation of a miniature rebellion. Inside, their breath hung misty in the cold air. The floor creaked, and the sunlight was strained through warped, dust-caked glass. They took turns posturing bravely in the darkness, sometimes competing to see who could stand perfectly still as the house groaned and settled, sometimes trying to find hidden treasures in the abandoned rooms. Trust, in that moment, was unspoken but absolute. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, a split second of clumsy bravado and devastating consequence. Climbing the winding, banisterless staircase to the second floor, Herman went first, steady and careful. Tom followed, his foot catching on a spot weakened by years of weather and neglect. The wood splintered with an ominous crack that still echoes in Herman's nightmares. Time itself seemed to stutter and lurch as Tom's body flailed in the empty air, arms windmilling in a desperate attempt to catch hold of something, anything. He fell, tumbling the full height of the stairwell, and landed at the bottom with a sickening thud that silenced everything: the wind outside, the ancient house itself, even the racing of Herman's heart. Tom's head struck the floor hard, and his limbs were twisted at impossible angles. Herman froze, sick to his stomach, as shock gave way to paralyzing terror. Screaming for help did little good. No one was close enough to hear. Herman scrambled to Tom's side, finding only shallow, gasping breaths and glassy, unfocused eyes. He held Tom's hand, pleading for him to wake up, to get up, to move. There was nothing else to be done but wait in agony, watched over only by the broken skeleton of the house and the gathering dusk. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before adults, alerted by a neighbor who had seen them sneak into the building, arrived. By then it was too late. Tom's funeral was a small affair. Kim Mountain was the kind of town where tragedy seemed to stick in the air. where the loss of one child sent ripples through every church pew and school desk. Herman's father didn't weep or hold his son in comfort. Instead, he muttered about the wages of disobedience and the lessons that must be learned from pain. Herman's mother tried to offer some comfort, but her strength had long since been depleted by years of silent suffering. The thing that seared itself most into Herman's mind after the funeral, however, wasn't the admonishments or the awkward embraces. It was the way Tom's mother sobbed, inconsolable, over the casket. Herman watched her hands clutch at the polished wood, as if trying to drag her son back from the void by sheer will alone. That sound of her grief would haunt him more than any angry word or crack of the rod. In the days and weeks that followed, guilt stalked Herman like a specter. He replayed the moment over and over, the crunch of the wood, Tom's cries, the sickening silence afterward. He withdrew, barely speaking at school, recoiling from any gesture of friendship. The world shifted on its axis for him. Where once there was the innocent thrill of adventure, now every risk felt like a potential death sentence. Where there was once laughter, there was a wall of terror and self-blame. He became unable to shake the irrational belief that his mere presence was a curse, portending disaster for those who dared come close. "Why not me?" he would whisper at night, hands clenched around the same bedsheets that once comforted him in fear of storms. Why did Tom have to go, and not me? This was more than just survivor's guilt. It was a crack that fissured deep, separating the life he'd known from the cold, spectral one that followed. With every day that passed, Herman felt the chasm widen, isolating him further and further not only from his peers, but also from himself. At home, things grew more strained. His father, mistaking trauma for defiance, grew even harsher. The rod found its target more often, and the words of the old proverb, "Spare the rod, spoil the child," sounded hollower and more sinister in Herman's ears. Each blow, rather than forging character, served only to drive the boy deeper into his grief and guilt. Left alone in his silence, Herman began to seek solace in strange places. He wandered to the outskirts of the cemetery, watching from behind the shelter of a tree as grave diggers rolled their wheelbarrows of earth. He memorized the shape of cemetery stones, the way the ground bulged over new graves, the quiet reverence that seemed to cloak the dead but never quite reach the living. These moments spent in the company of loss and memory would become the axis around which his life revolved. Over time, the trauma mutated into something peculiar. Where once he'd simply wished for Tom to return, he now found himself desiring to understand what had happened, to understand death itself, not just as an end, but as a process. The bones, the bloodless hush of the funeral parlor, these were the pieces he gathered, first in dread, then in fascination. The seeds of obsession with anatomy, with the boundaries between life and death, were planted in the humus of that winter afternoon. The death of Tom, then, wasn't just a terrible accident. It was the event that pulled the remaining supports from beneath Herman's already precarious childhood, sending him tumbling into a future as uncertain and haunted as the Phantom House itself. In retrospect, the trails of sorrow and curiosity and guilt left behind would wind together into the kind of story that small towns retell for generations. The day an ordinary boy lost his friend, and in so many ways lost himself as well. Herman had always been unusually sharp for his age. Even as a small boy in Kim Mountain, he could pick up on things most children missed, the way adults glanced at each other when certain family names came up in conversation, or how the wind shifted when a storm was brewing. His teachers noted how quickly he solved arithmetic sums and recited passages by heart, and neighbors would sometimes stop by just to marvel at the drawings he scrawled with charcoal scraps by the kitchen stove. Yet for all his cleverness, the world he moved through was never a playground. Kim Mountain, with all its creaking pines and endless winters, was an unforgiving place for a spirited child. Rigid expectations pressed on him from every angle, silent obedience at the family table, perfect posture in the church pews, and an absolute deference to his elders no matter how unjust or arbitrary their commands. The code of conduct was so much a part of the air he breathed that Herman rarely questioned its origins, only its application, which was often swift, harsh, and final. From an early age, Herman learned to shape his intelligence to survive. Quick thinking became quick avoidance. Reading the warning signs on his father's face was more important than following the plot of whatever book he was assigned for school. When the rod came down, as it inevitably did, branded as the will of God or what every boy needs, He learned to go somewhere else in his mind, to dissociate from pain and humiliation with the same ease others might turn a page. He cultivated a remarkable memory not simply to excel, but as a shield, never forgetting a slight, a threat, or the steps to avoid a beating. His home, more than anywhere, was where his agility was tested. The mood could shift from calm to stormy at a word, so he developed a sixth sense for impending danger. Even when no hands were raised, verbal jabs cut deep. Certain words, whip-smart and swift, could wound in ways a fist never could, and so Herman learned to be watchful, quiet, and exceptionally cautious, all while a restless torrent boiled under his skin. The contradictions of his upbringing left their mark, externally compliant, internally questioning, perpetually on edge. There was no room in the Mare household for childish logic or spontaneous laughter. Discipline masqueraded as love, affection came with conditions. Herman's intelligence, instead of being nourished, was often twisted into a source of trouble. His questions about scripture or science, the whys and hows that came so easily to him, were dismissed as impertinence. Even sin, the slap or the sneer would silence him faster than any sermon. He soon found that the less he revealed of his thoughts, the safer he was. So his mind became a private place, a garden walled off from parental scrutiny. School, too, was fraught. Teachers, even the well-meaning, echoed the community's values. Curiosity was only welcomed within a narrow, approved range. Too much wit could be mistaken for arrogance. A clever retort, no matter how innocent, bordered on insolence. Some of the other children envied or resented him, while others were simply wary. Stories of his father's sternness had a way of traveling fast. Herman learned to keep his head down, to deploy his talents only when absolutely necessary. But the qualities that could have made him thrive, his hunger for learning, his agile reasoning, his ability to see hidden patterns, became liabilities in a place that equated difference with danger. Over time, this distortion had consequences. Herman's cleverness curdled into something sharper and darker. He began to read people not to understand or empathize, but to manipulate and anticipate. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. If grown men could twist love into punishment, then surely every affectionate gesture hit a barbed hook. It was easier, safer, to outthink everyone and never show his true face. Beneath the surface, the violence at home left an even deeper imprint. Herman never cried in public, never allowed the bruises to show if he could help it, but he carried the humiliation with him silently. Each punishment taught him not the value of obedience, but the art of escape, how to sidestep, to scheme, to engineer excuses that might buy him a day or an hour of peace. The constant tension became his normal, his body coiled with the knowledge that safety was always provisional, kindness always had an expiration date. In rare moments, Herman glimpsed what life might be like without these constraints. When a sympathetic teacher let him stay after class to work on a project, or an old widow down the lane slipped him an extra apple tart, he felt a tentative sense of possibility, a world just beyond Kim Mountain's fences, where cleverness could be celebrated, not crushed. But those moments were brief and easily swept aside when he stepped back inside his father's domain. As he grew older, these contradictions only deepened. Puberty hit early, magnifying both his sense of isolation and his resentment. The more Herman understood about the hypocrisy of adults, the random cruelty of the world, the artificial boundaries of faith, the less inclined he became to accept the life laid out before him. His intelligence, once merely a coping mechanism, morphed into something akin to armor. He used words as darts, evaded rules with intricate planning, and nursed secret ambitions that his parents could never imagine. Still, the legacy of his upbringing could not be wholly escaped. There were nights when, lying curled in bed with his fists clenched and eyes hot, Herman could feel his father's voice echoing in every doubt, every pang of guilt. No matter how far he planned to run, a part of him was still that frightened, clever boy, endlessly adapting to someone else's definition of good. There was never a single moment when Herman could say he crossed the line, from intelligent boy to cunning survivor, from curious child to wary adolescent. It happened quietly, little by little, as surely as the seasons changed outside his window. By the time he left Kim Mountain, Herman knew he was not like the other boys, not in the ways they thought. His intelligence had become his mask and his weapon, shaped and sharpened by a world that mistrusted anything it could not easily restrain. A troubling fascination, when fear becomes morbid curiosity. For most people, terror is a doorstep. Once crossed, one desperately tries to retreat. But for Herman, a single traumatic experience would forever blur the line between horror and fixation. pushing him into an obsession that few could fathom or forgive. It began unexpectedly with what seemed like nothing more than a cruel prank, an ordinary day at school, boys being boys, mischief winding through the corridors like a draft on a winter morning. On that day, Herman was cornered by a group of older students, boys whose laughter always carried a sharper edge, perhaps sharp enough to wound. They discovered, either by rumor or accidental confession, that Herman was easily unsettled by the school's most macabre artifact, a full-sized anatomical skeleton, poorly assembled from yellowed bones and perched in the dim, drafty confines of the science teacher's office. For weeks, the boys teased him. They would clatter chalk across their desks to make ghostly sounds or whisper gruesome stories when the lights flickered at dusk. What had been a childish anxiety quickly escalated into a paralyzing dread. The ringleader hatched a plan one afternoon, dragging a resisting Herman down the hall as his heart pounded a desperate cadence. They shoved him into the office, locked the door, and jeered through the keyhole as Herman found himself face to face with the spectral skeleton in the gathering gloom. The bones rattled quietly in the draft, and for a moment it seemed as though the skeleton might move of its own accord. Herman's breath caught in his throat, and his eyes swam between panic and tears. He pounded on the door, begging to be released, but no help came. All he heard was the cackling delight of his tormentors fading away as they left him alone in that cryptic stillness. Minutes passed. How many, he could never later recall. At first terror threatened to tear him apart. He collapsed to the floor, arms over his head, as if to shield himself from invisible blows. Every nerve in his body ached for rescue. But then something peculiar happened. As his fear burned itself out, another feeling trickled in. Curiosity. He lay on the cold floor, heart still hammering, while his mind began to drift, unable to look away from the skeleton's empty stare. Herman forced himself to his knees. Bit by bit, he examined the figure before him. The longer he looked, the more the bones became familiar, even inviting, a kind of puzzle begging to be solved. He noticed details, the intricate mesh of ribs, the marbled depressions of the skull, the way each finger bone connected with such unlikely delicacy. Fear, and perhaps anger at the boys who locked him in, transmuted into a need to understand. Why did these bones, stripped of flesh and life, still seem to radiate a ghostly presence? What kept them together when everything living fell apart? Herman traced the contours with his eyes. He wondered about the person these bones once belonged to. He imagined them walking the same halls, laughing in the same schoolyard, wholly unaware of the fate that would one day reduce them to a science exhibit. The fragility, the mystery, it exerted a gravitational pull. For the first time, the dead no longer seemed distant or foreboding. They felt real and close, their secrets just barely out of reach. By the time a janitor found him, hours later, eyes bloodshot with unshed tears, Herman no longer trembled. He left the skeleton's side with a kind of reluctant reverence, not afraid but deeply altered. Something inside him had tilted. The strange mixture of horror and awe had etched itself deep into his mind, fusing trauma with a dangerous fascination that would never entirely fade. In the days that followed, nightmares plagued him. He drifted through sleep, seeing flesh melt from faces, dreaming of bodies reassembling themselves in silent demand. But beneath the terror, something thrilling lurked. Herman's thoughts swirled with questions about what lay beneath the skin, about the machinery and mystery of life and death. He found himself lingering on anatomy diagrams during school lessons, collecting discarded pages from medical encyclopedias, running his hands along his own bones as if to confirm their reality. This shift did not go unnoticed. Teachers remarked on his sudden silence and scholarly intensity. His mother, always anxious, became deeply unsettled by his newfound habit of spending hours alone, lost in books about biology and medical oddities. She scolded him for lingering too long with dark thoughts, but Herman could not, would not, let go. The line between obsession and inquiry blurred. What had begun as a coping mechanism, trying to master that which had once held such power over him, became a compulsion that colored every aspect of his private world. Soon, fear of death no longer haunted Herman quite as before. Rather, death became a riddle to unravel, a puzzle box demanding attention. He made friends with the school janitor, who sometimes let him sneak into the science office after hours. There, Herman would quiz him about bone names and how injuries healed, or why they sometimes didn't. He began to dabble in the grotesque, dissecting small animals found lifeless in the yard, collecting feathers and tiny skulls, all while keeping his activities masked from parental scrutiny. There was no cruelty in his studies, only a profound yearning to understand decay, to witness the silent transition from life to dust. Every lost pet, every dead bird, became an object lesson, the sort many children avert their eyes from, but which Herman attended to with the devotion of a priest performing a sacrament. This was more than curiosity, it was a transformation, a pivot from helpless victim to scientist of the morbid and the arcane. Herman's world grew narrower, but it also grew deeper, layered with secrets and silent questions. The skeleton in the schoolhouse was no longer his tormentor, it had become a silent mentor, imparting lessons he dared not share with any living soul. By the time rumors of his odd fixations swirled through the schoolyard, Herman barely cared. Other children gave him a wide berth, wary of the boy who picked bones from the creek bed or lingered alone in the cemetery shadows. Teachers found his essays chillingly articulate, his drawings alarmingly precise. His mother confiscated his anatomical sketches, but new ones always appeared. Herman learned to hide his ambitions, but inside he felt unmoored, detached from the innocence of his peers and bound instead to a fascination that promised both knowledge and damnation. Looking back, it's clear this moment marked the beginning of a profound shift within Herman, an indelible point of no return. The cruel prank in the school's dim office, the taunts and cackles receding into silence, were not merely incidents of playground malice. They were the catalyst that twisted terror, shame, and trauma into something else entirely. In other children, such an experience may have faded to a bad memory. For Herman, it became the heart of a dangerous hunger, a promise that if he could only master the secrets of bones and bodies, he might gain control over the fears that had once mastered him. Long before he ever set foot in a medical classroom, the seeds of obsession had been planted. They would flower in secrecy and solitude, fertilized by pain and an unyielding resolve to never again be at the mercy of what he didn't understand. Out of darkness, Herman crafted his own form of light, a cold, anatomical clarity. He ceased to see the world as his peers did. Death was not a shadow at the edge of life, but the foundation supporting all things, both beautiful and terrible in its certainty. This truth, born in a moment of cruelty, defined him long after the school days ended, shaping not only his ambitions but his very soul. The decay of childhood for Herman was not a sudden collapse but a gradual, relentless erosion, a process so inexorable that by the time he realized what was being lost, innocence had long been replaced by something cold and cunning. Growing up in Kim Mountain had already stitched suspicion and secrecy into the fabric of his days, but after the traumas of his early life, the scaffolding of his childhood began to give way to a darkness that few could imagine. Rather than finding solace or guidance in his family, Herman was left to navigate a maze of guilt, grief, and the burgeoning sense of intellectual superiority that made him both isolated and dangerous. By his mid-teens, Herman's inner world was a battleground. No matter how tightly he clung to the remnants of childish hope, the weight of loss, violence, and spiritual repression always drove him back to the same conclusion: only cunning would keep him safe. The church's empty promises, his father's rod, and the cold, cage-like house had all worked together to teach him that survival depended on outsmarting, not outloving those around him. He watched the townsfolk, pious, suspicious, and obsessed with propriety, and saw not community, but the weaknesses he could eventually exploit. Every slight, every unjust punishment became grist for his internal mill, feeding a resolve to never be powerless again. There was a point, somewhere between boyhood and adulthood, when Herman stopped simply enduring cruelty and began imagining how he might turn it to his own advantage. His intelligence, once stifled by fear, became his shield, and then his weapon. He lied with astonishing ease, first to avoid trouble, later simply to see if he could. He discovered that people often believed what they wanted to believe, especially if you told them what they needed to hear, dressed in a veneer of pious innocence or wounded vulnerability. Teachers praised his cleverness but never suspected the contempt simmering behind every obedient answer. Neighbors who pitied him after his friend's death could not see the calculations whirring just beneath the surface. By the time he was 17, the boundaries between right and wrong had blurred so thoroughly that moral compasses seemed like relics better suited for other lives, simpler, luckier ones. Herman's marriage to Clara Lovering was hastily arranged, sparked by a mixture of adolescent desire, economic necessity, and the unspoken belief that maybe proximity to another person would quiet the ravenous engine of his ambition. The moment she became his wife, however, Clara transformed from a person into a piece in his game. He was kind when it served him, cruel when he needed leverage, his affections as transactional as the coins jangling in his always empty pockets. College was never about education, it was about opportunity. Herman forged, lied, manipulated, and bribed his way into the hallowed halls of medical school, not to learn but to access the reservoirs of status and knowledge that would allow him to outperform, outsmart, outmaneuver. Where other students pored over their textbooks out of curiosity or duty, Herman dissected cadavers with a single-minded intensity that unnerved even the most jaded anatomy professors. Death, once terrifying then fascinating, became the raw material for his schemes. He saw desperate families, unclaimed bodies, and the loopholes in the insurance policies that piled up in the administrative offices, and a plan began to form. The first time he swapped a nameless corpse for one of his contrived clients, filed the paperwork and pocketed an insurance payout, it felt as natural as breathing. Moral boundaries already faded were finally erased. What did it matter if no one loved the dead man, if his own alibi was airtight, if the world remained none the wiser? Each small success blurred the horror of what he was becoming, salving his justified self-doubt with the cold balm of profit and control. Herman moved through the world with a growing detachment, setting aside love and loyalty, comfort and conscience, in favor of the singular thrill of getting away with something forbidden. Financial pressure was the ever-present drumbeat beneath his actions. He drifted from job to job, always trailed by debts and whispered suspicions. Clara, recognizing the change in her husband but unable to name its source, slowly withdrew. When she finally left, quietly, desperately, Herman felt not sorrow, but a sharp, almost clinical sense of liberation. Attachments had become liabilities, slowing the relentless advance of his ambition. He abandoned New Hampshire without a backward glance, slipping from one state to the next, always a step ahead of unpaid creditors, disappointed landlords, and, eventually, the watchful gaze of law enforcement. With every fresh start in a new city, Albany, Philadelphia, Buffalo, New York, Herman refined his trade, the art of disguise and reinvention. He took jobs at drugstores, dabbled in real estate, sold snake oil as a traveling salesman. If someone disappeared in his wake, there were no bodies, no evidence. Suspicion clung but never took root. America in the late 19th century was a nation built for reinvention, and Herman used this to his full advantage. He learned to read desperation in the eyes of strangers, to sniff out opportunity in chaos, to see in every new acquaintance either a tool or a target. Names were disposable, like the lives he brushed past or used up. What entertained or distracted most men, he viewed as practice for something bigger, something grander and darker brewing just beyond the horizon. When the lure of anonymity and opportunity drew him to Chicago, Herman felt an almost mythic sense of possibility. The city, sprawling, energetic, packed with drifters and dreamers, was the ideal laboratory for whatever ambitions he could muster. Adopting the name Henry Howard Holmes, he cast off the last remnants of his old life and began to build an identity based not on survival, but on predation. In Chicago there were fortunes and lives to be made, or destroyed, if only one had the wit to seize them. By now, what little tenderness or self-doubt might have clung to Herman's soul had weathered away. All that remained was a cold understanding. The world was divided into predators and prey, and he would never again allow himself to be the latter. Every childhood injury, every slight, every instance of powerless terror was transmuted into ambition. What disappeared from his life was not just the innocence of youth, but the capacity to regret, to mourn, to turn back from the precipice of monstrous intent. The decay of childhood was complete. All that remained was desire and design, a hunger to act, unrestrained, upon a world he now knew how to wound. After Clara left, the course of Herman's life spun loose, untethered as a ship cut free from its moorings on a dark, gusty sea. The world outside New Hampshire held no roots, only possibilities and risks, in equal measure. Losing his wife was unsettling, and a relief. There was nothing left in Kim Mountain except ghosts and shadows, none of which haunted him enough to stay. The old formulas no longer applied. Now survival, and perhaps vindication, stood as his only guides. He drifted first to New York, footsteps swallowed up by the bustle of Albany, then the crowds of Philadelphia, and onward to other nameless towns he would never think of again. In each place, his past identity grew lighter, as if each new town scrubbed away a bit more of Herman's original self, until even he felt the name Merritt grow foreign. Clara's absence was a double-edged sword, freedom to invent, but vulnerability as well. He learned to move in silence, to fold himself into the scenery, always observing, always scanning for threats and opportunities. For a while he took respectable jobs, a clerk in a pharmacy, an assistant in a doctor's powder-smelling back room. Herman played the roles with the ease of a man who'd spent his life navigating minefields, polite, dependable, eager to please. But even as he wore these personae, he kept a mental distance. He never lingered in one place long enough for neighbors to memorize his face, always making sure that acquaintances remained just that, never friends. He lived in rented rooms above laundries, in cheap tenements, exchanging pleasantries with landladies who would not remember him a month after he'd vanished. I often imagine what these towns looked like to him: humid windows clouded by winter breath, muddy streets, and gas lights flickering as conversations hushed near the alleyways. There was always the smell of damp wood and boiled cabbage, the restless energy of transients, and the silent enmity of small-town suspicion. It was no place to put down roots, but it was perfect for hiding in plain sight. Herman became adept at blending, never so dull as to attract suspicion, but never so memorable as to evoke curiosity. He developed a knack for disappearing the very moment the questions got too pointed, or when a missing neighbor started talk. Some towns gossiped, others kept secrets. Either way, he moved before the rumors could solidify. It didn't take long for the pattern to develop. In every new town, there would come a point, sooner or later, when he was scrutinized too closely. Maybe it was the disappearance of a tenant from the boarding house a few days after Herman arrived, or an odd discrepancy in the pharmacy's ledger, or the simple realization that he never seemed to receive mail. Sometimes it was nothing more than the prickly intuition of wives and mothers who noticed how quickly Herman's smile faded when he thought no one was looking. When that happened, he packed up and moved before anyone could connect his presence to the oddities left in his wake. Pennsylvania, then upstate New York, then back down along the eastern seaboard, Herman left behind a trail of half-finished jobs, suspicious disappearances, and nervous landlords. Newspaper columns sometimes mentioned a transient assistant, or an unknown man seen near the site, but the details were never precise, never enough for police to pursue anything more than idle queries. He swapped his name as easily as his address, testing new aliases with every move. With each reinvention, he shed pieces of guilt and memory. The further he moved from Kim Mountain, the less he felt like the boy who had once crouched shivering on the cold floor of a farmhouse. This perpetual motion fed something in him, a hunger for mastery over the story of his own life. The old terror of being trapped, by family, by fate, by violence, gave way to the exhilaration of slipping the noose again and again. He relished the uncertainty even as he feigned unease. There's a particular kind of thrill in watching suspicion turn into doubt, and then into reluctant acceptance. Herman learned to savor it, knowing that every departure was another escape, another little victory over a world that once seemed to have him cornered. Of course, he was never entirely free from danger. Sometimes he caught a glimpse of a familiar face among strangers at the railway depot, or heard talk of a Pinkerton inquiry in the next town over. There were tense nights spent crouched in back rooms, listening to drunken voices drift up from the street, waiting for the sound of a boot on the stair. Herman believed in luck, but trusted his preparation more. He carried forged documents and always kept an exit plan. If someone called him by the wrong name, he refused to flinch, a master of the passing shrug, the polite laugh, the answer that never gave quite enough away. It was in these drifting years, moving like a shadow across the Northeast and Midwest, that he began to understand the full power of anonymity. In America, at the turn of the century, identity was terrifyingly fluid. Names were as disposable as yesterday's newspaper. All that was required was to act like you belonged. He cultivated new skills, the ability to read people quickly, to mimic dialect, to invent details about a childhood that had never existed, all so that he could slip seamlessly into whatever mold his next role demanded. What fascinates me about this period in Herman's journey is not just the mechanics of his deceit, but the transformation it wrought on his psyche. With every town crossed off his invisible ledger, he abandoned another expectation, of love, of loyalty, of home. What had once been a child's wary glance became the practiced detachment of a man who saw ties as threats and freedom as synonymous with solitude. Each time he walked away from an old life, he felt less haunted, but also, perhaps, a bit less human. Arriving eventually in Chicago, Herman stood at the threshold of ultimate reinvention. Chicago offered everything an ambitious man could crave: chaos, anonymity, opportunity, and most importantly, the chance to become anyone at all. The city throbbed with the energy of the World's Fair, its streets swollen with dreamers, drifters, and the desperate. No one questioned a new arrival with impeccable manners and credentials that could withstand only the most cursory inspection. Herman shed his past completely with a legal name change, adopting the moniker Henry Howard Holmes. It was a name with no history, perfectly suited to the city's feverish promise of rebirth. Under this new identity, Holmes rebranded himself. He set up shop in the Southside's Englewood neighborhood, seamlessly becoming a respected member of the community. The genial pharmacist, the attentive landlord, the shrewd businessman, these were all roles Herman, now Holmes, played with chilling authenticity. Not a trace of Kim Mountain showed in his posture or cadence. Whatever suspicion might have lingered in the backwaters of New England, in Chicago, Henry Howard Holmes became an enigma, his past erased except for what he chose to reveal. But the darkness that had gathered during his years of wandering did not dissipate, it condensed, sharpened. Without the tether of any old identity, Holmes found himself empowered to pursue ambitions both grand and grisly. He learned to exploit the city's transient population, its abundance of young women looking for work, lonely travelers and vanished families all lost in the city's sprawling census. Here truly, his talent for disguise and disappearance reached its zenith. With every new scheme, every identity assumed, the distance between the frightened boy of New Hampshire and the calculating man in Chicago grew irrevocably wide. In shedding his old name, Herman did not just abandon his past, he weaponized it, using everything hardship had taught him to become someone who could never again be caught. To the outside world, Chicago in the late 1880s was a city of explosive growth and unlimited promise, a place where fortunes were made overnight and the skyline seemed to change by the month. But beneath the excitement, the city seethed with shadows. Corruption, poverty, and anonymity provided perfect cover for a man intent on building more than just a livelihood. For Herman, now known as Henry Howard Holmes, Chicago was a blank canvas, and he planned to paint it with both genius and horror. The idea for what would become infamous as the Murder Castle was not born overnight. It was the culmination of years marked by secrecy, deception, and an escalating thirst for control. Holmes was fascinated by architecture, not in the traditional sense of creating comfort or beauty, but rather in constructing an environment perfectly tailored to his darker desires. He began by purchasing a lopsided lot at the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street, on the edge of the bustling Englewood neighborhood. In an area frequented by new arrivals and traveling salesmen, Holmes's new project would attract little initial scrutiny, exactly as he intended. He presented the venture as a practical business move. The ground floor, he explained to neighbors and investors, would house retail spaces, including his own pharmacy, which had already granted him respect in the community. Above, he would build apartments and small hotel rooms to cater to the relentless influx of visitors and workers, especially with the 1893 World's Fair on the horizon. The story checked out, and Holmes levered it to solicit credit, loans, and construction materials on margin, cleverly playing banks and suppliers against each other. He rotated workers constantly, making sure that no single laborer or contractor ever understood the entirety of the blueprint. If anyone asked questions, Holmes responded with a smile. A wall would be torn down, a new order issued, or the worker simply dismissed and paid only a fraction of what was owed. Behind that business-like facade, though, the construction was anything but ordinary. Holmes designed the upper 2 floors into a labyrinthine puzzle, windowless corridors that turned at odd angles, stairways leading to solid brick walls, doors opening into gaping drops, trapdoors concealed in the flooring, and secret chutes that disappeared straight into the cellar darkness. Some rooms were fitted with hidden peepholes or gas fixtures Holmes could control from his private office. Others were lined with asbestos-coated steel, completely soundproofed, their doors sealed from the outside so no cry could ever escape. He drew inspiration from his own blend of medical knowledge, architectural reading, and a disturbingly inventive imagination. For Holmes, every detail served a purpose. The mysterious blueprints were constantly revised, tweaks made as new requirements occurred to him. To outsiders, the changes seemed arbitrary, even careless. But nothing about the layout was accidental. In one chamber, gas jets were rigged so an occupant could be asphyxiated at will. In another, a hidden trapdoor dropped directly into a grease-slicked chute, ending in the cellar where Holmes set up a crude surgical table for dismemberment and later disposal. Some doors could only be opened from the outside, others locked of their own accord behind anyone unfortunate enough to enter. There was even a concealed vault, airtight and lined with iron, where Holmes tested suffocation as a method of murder. The basement, arguably the most chilling aspect of the castle, stood as a final repository for Holmes's infernal designs. Down here he installed lime pits, quicklime barrels, and furnaces stoked for hours on end. Leftover bodies were stripped, flesh dissolved or burned, and bones sometimes sold to local medical schools. What could not be sold or disguised was destroyed or buried, lost in the labyrinth's shifting architecture. Holmes even collaborated with local medical students and grave robbers, trading knowledge and remains quietly for money or favors. If authorities ever inquired, Holmes would feign outrage or confusion, easily hiding evidence in plain sight or deep within the castle's twisted underbelly. Workers bore witness to the endless oddities: walls that appeared and vanished, pipes leading nowhere, orders to install locks on the outside of bedroom doors, and blueprints constantly rewritten, some destroyed as soon as sections were completed. When questioned, Holmes would offer explanations both plausible and outlandish, rifling through an endless bank of lies with charismatic ease. Some dismissed his eccentricities as harmless secrets of a quirky landlord, never suspecting the nightmare their hands were helping realize. Others wondered, but the fear of losing pay or crossing the doctor kept curiosity sharply in check. The true genius and depravity of Holmes's murder castle was that it operated in full view of the world, masquerading as just another hotel and business in the urban jungle of Chicago. Newcomers flooded in, especially when the World's Fair came to town, young women in search of work, travelers, salesmen, and families seeking cheap lodging. Anonymity in big city life was Holmes's best ally. The ever-churning masses ensured that missing persons might raise only the faintest concern for days, weeks, or longer, more than enough time for evidence to disappear into lime or fire. All the while, Holmes crafted his persona as a successful, enterprising, unfailingly polite professional. He hosted neighbors, bought advertisements, and charmed everyone from shopkeepers to bank managers. Only those who worked closely with him sensed anything amiss: his uncanny demands for privacy, the ever-changing workforce, and his refusal to allow anyone access to the castle unsupervised. For Holmes, the castle symbolized not only his control over life and death, but also his confidence in outsmarting the world's scrutiny. It was the ultimate criminal experiment, a place where curiosity could be fatal, and the architecture of evil was hidden behind 3 stories of brick and mortar. The disappearing trail of victims. From the moment the grand doors of Holmes's so-called hotel swung open to the public on the eve of the World's Fair, there began a quietly unnerving procession of arrivals who would never be seen again. Chicago, already a city in the middle of an unprecedented population explosion, provided Holmes with the ideal camouflage. The influx of travelers, job seekers, single women seeking opportunity, and fairgoers washed into the city every day by the thousands, young, ambitious, and almost always unaccompanied by anyone who would go searching for them if they happened to vanish. Holmes's hotel, with its welcoming advertisements, affordable rates, and convenient proximity to the fair's attractions, served as a magnet for precisely those who were most vulnerable. Holmes had honed his skills as a predator long before the hotel, but the scope of opportunity now available to him brought a new clinical efficiency to his malice. He staffed the building with a seemingly ever-changing roster of employees, young women and men, many of them new to the city, desperate for work, and willing to accept Holmes's odd demands. He required his workers to live on site, ostensibly to maintain order, but actually ensuring that he could surveil them, control their contact with the outside world, and, if necessary, eliminate them with no trace. He was a master of obfuscation. Holmes often recorded guests under false names, destroyed records, and managed his correspondence through elaborate layers of misdirection. Visitors checked in with high hopes: an aspiring stenographer from Iowa, a newlywed couple dazzled by the city lights, a traveling salesman seeking a few nights' rest, and frequently never checked out. Holmes had a predatory instinct for selecting those least likely to be missed: unattached women, isolated men with no local friends, even whole families who had left behind only ambiguous letters to distant relatives, describing their promising new start in Chicago. Some guests would vanish within days. To their families, the silence might be attributed to the chaos and distraction of the World's Fair, or optimistic new beginnings. By the time worry set in, the trail was already cold. Others, like Holmes's secretaries, mistresses, or favorite employees, sometimes lingered longer. Holmes was adept at manipulation. He charmed, coerced, and isolated his victims, gradually luring them deeper into his web. A few were convinced to sign over property titles or life insurance forms before they disappeared. Holmes's confidence and calm reassurance masked a chilling calculation. He could convince anyone of anything right up until the moment the door locked behind them. The hotel was a labyrinth by design. Many victims were physically trapped, guided to soundproof rooms, windowless chambers, or dead-end corridors, concealed behind false doors. Some were drugged and suffocated in airtight vaults, others were gassed, strangled, or simply disappeared into the bowels of the building. Holmes kept the layout in perpetual flux, hiring and firing construction crews, ensuring no one but himself understood the secrets of the structure. Maids, porters, and delivery boys often vanished after being seen in the wrong place at the wrong time, or expressing too much curiosity about the hotel's oddities. People vanished so routinely that rumors began to swirl among some of the staff and neighbors, but fear, or Holmes's uncanny ability to allay suspicion, kept most from asking questions. Whenever police or relatives did come knocking, Holmes produced plausible stories. The missing girl moved on to a new job, the salesman transferred to another city, the young couple abruptly reconciled with family in Cleveland and left without a word. His immaculate appearance, calm demeanor, and respectability as a pharmacist and businessman shielded him from scrutiny. Chicago in the 1890s was a city that swallowed people whole, and Holmes had become its most insatiable maw. There were signature patterns among Holmes's victims, yet he remained unpredictable and opportunistic. Some he lured into romantic or business entanglements. Julia Connor, an employee whose affair turned fatal, Emmeline Segrind promised marriage and then quietly erased. Minnie and Nanny Williams, sisters whose inheritance Holmes sought to steal, leaving only traces in forged signatures and desperate letters. There were children among the missing too, a chilling testament to Holmes's complete lack of empathy or boundary. Each disappearance bore a similar aftermath: abrupt cessation of contact, belongings left behind in hastily cleared guest rooms or packed trunks never retrieved, and a lingering thread of plausible deniability Holmes could tug if pressed. The World's Fair, a carnival of fleeting encounters and shifting allegiances, was the perfect stage to obscure these vanishings. Fairgoers who went missing became yet another face lost in a swelling city, their absence rationalized amid an ocean of newcomers and departing strangers. As the months passed, the list of the missing continued to grow, each name a grim entry in a secret ledger. The hotel's basement, later unearthed by investigators, revealed the full scale of the horror: human remains dismembered and destroyed, lime pits erasing all but the most stubborn evidence, fragments of jewelry and clothing hidden behind false walls. Holmes was methodical not just in killing but in disposing of bodies. On occasion he even sold skeletons and organs to medical schools for profit, making sure that death itself became an enterprise. Some families never learned the fate of their loved ones, consigned instead to endless years of uncertainty. Others received vague, typed notes from Holmes or his aliases, offering false reassurances or clever diversions. In time, the mounting losses caught the attention of police and journalists, but by then, the machinery of disappearance was already in full operation, and Holmes's list of victims, estimated at dozens, perhaps even more, had become one of the most chilling legacies in American criminal history. Peeling back the walls of Holmes's murder castle, we find a structure meticulously engineered for secrecy, cruelty, and calculated horror, a labyrinthine testament to H. Holmes's dark genius. The outside appeared as an ordinary 3-story brick building with a welcoming storefront pharmacy and bustling guest house signage. Behind this comforting facade, however, Holmes constructed an edifice of confusion, menace, and pain designed to befuddle, entrap, and destroy. Entering through the grand lobby, visitors might immediately sense a peculiar ambiguity. Some corridors were brightly lit and modern for their era, while others seemed to close in, with strange twists and sudden, inexplicable dead ends. The architecture was no accident. Holmes constantly hired and fired teams of builders, forbidding each crew from ever seeing the complete floor plan. This piecemeal construction meant that not a single worker, except Holmes himself, understood the true scale and function of the internal maze. Some rooms would be built, then boarded up days later. Hallways shifted, doors moved or were bolted from inside, and stairways went nowhere or vanished entirely overnight. On the upper floors, guests expecting comfort and privacy stepped instead into a web of traps. Several rooms were expertly soundproofed, lined with thick iron plates behind perfectly ordinary-looking wallpaper and wood paneling. Pipelines snaked through walls and ceilings like veins, carefully installed to connect to hidden tanks of gas or acid. Holmes could fill selected rooms with toxic fumes at will, controlling the valves from a concealed office desk. In some cases, guests would never see or smell the danger before losing consciousness. Hidden peepholes and sliding panels gave Holmes unfettered surveillance over his charges. He could watch their every move from secret alcoves, sometimes tormenting them with sudden rattling noises in the air shafts or unlocking doors remotely to test for panic. Some rooms had cleverly disguised trapdoors in the floors or ceilings. With the flick of a hidden lever, a victim might find themselves plummeting through a chute directly into the dungeon-like basement. The stairwells themselves inspired dread. Some were made intentionally to disorient, angling into pitch-black spaces or ending abruptly in blank walls. A guest who wandered off their route, perhaps searching for a bathroom or trying to leave in the night, could easily become lost for hours, stalked by the building's architect or intercepted by his enforcers. Narrow service elevators, supposedly for staff and supplies, were converted to bear weighty, unconscious bodies down to the lowest level without a sound. The basement, more infamous than any other part of the murder castle, was Holmes's private domain of death. Sheltered by thick, fireproof walls and accessible only through a series of false doors and hidden staircases, it appeared at first to be a normal storeroom. On closer inspection, it revealed itself as something far more sinister. Surgical tables waited under gas lamps, large vats filled with corrosive chemicals stood ready to dissolve flesh to bone. A massive furnace dominated one corner, its hearth blackened by more than mere coal. Secret rooms in the cellar held tools and instruments for dissection, along with bins for storing bones and teeth for later disposal or illicit sale. Holmes had outfitted the space with drainage specially routed into the city's sewers, allowing him to wash away the evidence of his crimes with unnerving efficiency. The chilling detail of the operation spoke volumes. Nothing was left to improvisation, and every horror was premeditated. What made the castle uniquely dreadful was its constantly shifting architecture. Holmes was not just an opportunist, he was a designer of confusion, continually installing and removing walls, changing the shapes of rooms, and keeping even his most trusted employees guessing. In some sections, the floors were lined with asbestos to muffle desperate screams. In others, false walls cloaked hidden passages where Holmes could appear and disappear like a phantom. On rare occasions, a guest or staff member would stumble upon an unfinished corridor or a locked door behind the wallpaper. Those who dared to ask questions would soon be dismissed from service for insubordination, or gently threatened into silence. Holmes himself seemed to possess a psychic connection to the building. He always knew where to find anyone, tracking their progress through peepholes, vents, and hidden ladders. Special attention was lavished on rooms with bespoke torture devices. Some had floors that could be tilted via crank, sending the unwitting directly into sub-basements. Others were equipped with one-way mirrors to monitor reactions, or fitted with beds that collapsed into sealed compartments. Holmes collected medical and mortuary equipment under legitimate pretexts, making his basement appear at first glance to be the workspace of a scientist rather than a murderer. In reality, every tool, every innovation, had a singular purpose: to make human disappearance and disposal efficient, untraceable, and utterly terrifying. By the time Holmes's victims realized that something was terribly wrong, escape was rarely possible. Complex locks, many of them custom-made without keys, kept doors sealed from the outside. Some rooms boasted vents that permitted no airflow, smothering occupants in silence. Claustrophobia, confusion, and terror worked together, orchestrated by the mind that dreamed this hellscape into being. The hotel's very geography became an accomplice to crime. Fugitives might run through hallways that looped back on themselves or ended in bricked-up passages. The uninitiated could stumble for hours, never finding an exit, while Holmes casually tracked their every move. Even seasoned staff accepted, sometimes with uneasy resignation, that the castle seemed to operate by rules of its own. Whispers of mysterious rooms and staff members who moved on unexplained swirled throughout the building, but the power of Holmes's charisma, and the fear of his wrath, kept most questions unasked. Strangely, despite all of this terror behind closed doors, the atmosphere on the ground floor was one of apparent warmth and businesslike order. The pharmacy flourished, the restaurant attracted regulars, and Holmes maintained the persona of a doting entrepreneur. But for those who ventured past the public spaces through doorways marked private, the sheer malice of the man and the monstrosity of the building revealed themselves in full. Ultimately, Holmes's castle was more than a collection of bricks and beams. It was a living reflection of its creator's mind. Its complexities and cruelties mirrored Holmes's intellect and pathological detachment. To walk its corridors was to step deep into the inner workings of a predator's psyche, a place where mercy, logic, and even hope itself dissolved among the shadows and the walls. The murder castle remains to this day the most chilling architecture of evil in American criminal lore, engineered not for comfort, not for profit, but for the cold fulfillment of its master's deepest, darkest desires. After the horrors inside Holmes's murder castle claimed their victims, the story didn't end with death. In fact, it was often just the beginning of a grisly enterprise that turned the very bodies of the deceased into profit. This new chapter in Holmes's criminal evolution leaned on the bustling backdrop of Gilded Age America, a world rapidly modernizing, obsessed with scientific progress and plagued by an undercurrent of lawlessness that made tracking the dead nearly impossible. Holmes recognized that in the chaos of a city like Chicago, a skilled operator could find countless ways to profit from the nameless, the lost, and the forgotten. The city's reputation as a place where thousands arrived daily and nearly as many vanished meant the authorities were constantly overwhelmed. Holmes took full advantage of this anonymity. Once a victim was dispatched within the castle's walls, whether by gas, drugs, or more direct violence, the process of concealment and monetization began almost immediately. Down in the labyrinthine basement, Holmes maintained a suite of grim accoutrements: surgical tables, anatomical saws, vats of corrosive acids, and pits for quicklime. His experience in medicine and anatomy served him well here. Many of the bodies were stripped of valuables, rings, watches, jewelry, or in rare cases precious documents, all of which Holmes would pawn on Chicago's burgeoning black market or sell under false names. But the larger enterprise came in the form of the bodies themselves. Holmes had a keen understanding of the growing demand for cadavers and anatomical specimens among medical schools and research institutions in the late 19th century. The legitimate market for bodies far outstripped legal supply. Families buried their dead quickly, and grave robbing was already a shadow industry. Holmes realized he was uniquely positioned, with a steady supply of victims, knowledge of dissection, and connections in both the medical field and the city's criminal underbelly. He could essentially turn his crimes into an ongoing business. Some corpses were meticulously cleaned of flesh in acid pits, leaving behind only bone. Holmes would articulate these skeletons, painstakingly wiring and mounting them for ease of study, anatomically correct, with a level of craftsmanship that often elicited praise from clients who never asked too many questions about provenance. Such specimens would fetch handsome sums from unscrupulous anatomy professors, medical students desperate for practice, or traveling lecturers who taught anatomy or cameos of abnormality. Even before the bones were sold, Holmes sometimes harvested study pieces, organs, skulls, or other anatomical curiosities, culled and preserved in jars of alcohol or formaldehyde. These were shipped off to collectors or medical men who paid well for remains that were, for all intents and purposes, impossible to trace. But selling bodies was a dangerous endeavor, requiring a blend of secrecy, showmanship, and absolute control. Holmes never dealt directly with buyers. Instead, he employed a network of intermediaries, former classmates, shady undertakers, or contacts within the transportation system who could move crates labeled as lab equipment or specimen kits. Invoices and communications were carefully faked, with names, dates, and destinations muddled to obscure any direct connection to the castle. Holmes's success in this grim commerce depended almost entirely on his ability to erase all evidence linking victim to perpetrator. He experimented with the best ways to dispose of what couldn't be used. Bodies too damaged for sale were cremated in the castle's monstrous furnace or buried in lime pits to hasten decomposition. Any clothing, luggage, or personal effects that might be connected to the missing were either destroyed or resold under aliases far from Chicago. The goal was always efficiency. No evidence, no risk, maximum return. There was a twisted pragmatism to Holmes's methods that bordered on industrial. He tracked which medical schools paid best, which university professors asked the fewest questions, and which shipping routes allowed for the least scrutiny. He understood the rhythms of college semesters, the rush for cadavers at the start of session, and timed his shipments accordingly. If a particular victim showed signs of disease, rare anatomy, or unusual size, Holmes would take special care to offer that specimen as a unique case study, sometimes forging a fake history or pathology to increase the sale value. Regardless of the victim's fate, every trace was accounted for. Diagrams and records never mentioned real names, only codes or false initials. Holmes compartmentalized his knowledge so thoroughly that even if suspected, it was nearly impossible for investigators to unravel where the bodies originated or ended up. He was also always ready to move on. If a single medical supplier or dealer started showing too much curiosity, he would end the relationship, finding another more pliable partner. Yet as methodical as he was, Holmes occasionally gambled for bigger payoffs. On several occasions he orchestrated insurance schemes using the bodies of his victims. By forging documents, falsifying death certificates, and enlisting accomplices to pose as grieving relatives or witnesses, he claimed payouts from life insurance policies taken out on employees, associates, or women lured into his schemes. Sometimes these deaths were staged as tragic accidents, drowning, poison, or accidental falls, with Holmes always ready to explain away suspicions with legal jargon and confident charm. Over time the pattern became clear, but only to those looking closely. A rising tide of people disappearing from Chicago's margins, a steady trickle of medical curiosities showing up at university dissections, and a peculiar consistency in the manner and professionalism of their preparation. Even so, the sheer transience of Gilded Age America worked in Holmes's favor. The city was full of drifters, job seekers, and those with no social roots, perfect prey for a predator who could make the dead vanish as profitably as the living. Holmes rarely exhibited remorse or second thoughts about his enterprising disposal of human life. On the contrary, he seemed to admire the skill and intelligence he brought to his grisly trade. The few who came too close, curious employees, suspicious delivery men, or would-be blackmailers, were simply added to the chain of supply and demand, victims of a system Holmes himself had engineered. By the time police began to grow suspicious, the evidence of his crimes had been scattered across Chicago and beyond, turned to ash, bone, or scientific display. Some parcels of bones shipped to out-of-state colleges were irrecoverable, and those rare few who stumbled onto a hint of the operation found themselves stonewalled by Holmes's charm, bribery, or simple threats. The legacy of these atrocities was not just the loss of life, but the transformation of death itself into a market commodity, one which Holmes, with cold precision, exploited to its utmost limits. In the waning days of the 19th century, as the embers of the World's Fair died down, and Chicago's population began to settle from the fever pitch of years prior, the net began to close quietly around H. Holmes. For nearly a decade, Holmes had operated with stunning impunity, slipping in and out of identities, city blocks, and legal technicalities. His murder castle, situated in the heart of Englewood, had become an unassuming tomb for countless souls. But even the most carefully constructed web cannot go unnoticed forever, especially as the disappearances began to arc beyond misfortune into the realm of the suspicious and the grotesque. It all started unraveling not in Chicago but far to the east, on a Boston street in 1894, when Holmes was arrested for a simple act of horse theft. The irony could not have been lost on investigators. The man who had gotten away with so many far darker acts was finally apprehended for a crime rooted in desperation rather than brutality. Yet it was this seemingly mundane caper that allowed authorities to begin unwinding the chaotic ledger of Holmes's myriad transgressions. Behind the scenes, a Pinkerton detective agency, America's most dogged private investigators, had begun tracking Holmes in earnest. Suspicion had long dogged his footsteps, particularly after Holmes attempted a convoluted insurance fraud with his longtime associate, Benjamin Petetzel. The scheme seemed simple on paper: fake Petetzel's death to claim the insurance, then disappear into the anonymity of America's vastness. But greed and hubris undid them. Rather than a staged death, Holmes murdered Petetzel for real. Then, in an even darker turn, he continued traveling with Petetzel's wife and children, manipulating and deceiving them while plotting their ultimate fate. With Holmes in custody for horse theft, investigators turned their gaze to the mountain of rumors trailing his movements. Philadelphia authorities soon discovered the remains of Petetzel, confirming that the supposed insurance scam had been a cover for murder. With every passing week, more connections emerged. From the vanished Williams sisters to the missing Julia Connor and her daughter, each thread leading inexorably back to the labyrinthine corridors of the murder castle. Meanwhile, the Chicago police launched a painstaking search of Holmes's three-story monument to cruelty. Inside, the walls confessed what silence could not: hidden rooms filled with stains and strange tools, secret passages leading to nothing but brick, vault doors sealed from the outside, and the lingering metallic tang of old violence. Investigators unearthed charred remains, bones, jewelry, and personal effects, each a chilling testament to the horrors quietly swallowed up by the castle's bricks. Holmes initially denied everything, spinning tales with his characteristic calm and unsettling charm. He claimed innocence, painted himself as a victim of conspiracy, and invented ever more outrageous aliases in an attempt to muddy the investigation. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and various witnesses, former employees, left-behind relatives, jilted creditors, were eager to testify. The prosecution built a case not just around intent and means, but around a pattern of vanishment so pronounced it bordered on the impossible. As news of the investigation spread, the American public became both enthralled and horrified. Newspapers from coast to coast ran lurid headlines: "Chicago's Bluebeard caught at last," and "Castle of Horror yields its dead." Spectators flocked to the trial, desperate for a glimpse of the man whose very name had become synonymous with evil. Courtrooms overflowed, and reporters documented every expression Holmes wore, each confident smile, each denial, each cold assessment of the evidence against him. The trial itself was a spectacle that fused tabloid intrigue with a sense of national reckoning. Holmes faced a battery of charges, ranging from insurance fraud and theft to multiple counts of murder. The Philadelphia case, centered around the murder of Benjamin Petetzel and his 3 children, was the most open and shut, with undeniable evidence linking Holmes directly to the crimes. The murders in Chicago, while harder to prove individually due to Holmes's extraordinary skill at erasing evidence, nonetheless formed a chilling circumstantial mosaic. Holmes, ever the actor, conducted his own defense with a mix of feigned sincerity and chilling detachment. He cross-examined witnesses, proposed alternate theories, and played to the gallery with an unsettling showman's poise. At times he seemed to relish his notoriety, writing confessions and recantations to the newspapers, spinning new tales of victims and collaborators that only further deepened the American public's morbid fascination. Holmes's shifting stories, sometimes confessing to some murders, sometimes claiming innocence, confounded investigators and readers alike. His testimony veered from plausible to fantastical, describing secret societies and shadowy accomplices, but delivering no substantiated proof except his own word. The jury, however, was not so easily beguiled. The overwhelming forensic and witness evidence in the Petetzel case, as well as the mountain of circumstantial evidence from the castle, left them little room for doubt. As the verdict was delivered, guilty of murder in the first degree, Holmes's legendary composure finally cracked, just for a moment. He was sentenced to death by hanging, the punishment for his catalogue of horrors at last decided in the stern glare of justice. But Holmes's time in prison was no less sensational than his life on the outside. His cell became a hub for journalists, eager to extract confessions or lies masquerading as them from the infamous killer. Holmes, ever the narcissist, obliged with gusto. He penned a memoir detailing his early life and crimes in grandiose, often contradictory fashion, and dictated new stories almost daily. In his final confessions, Holmes claimed upwards of 27 murders, though most investigators believe the true tally could be much higher, with estimates sometimes exceeding 50 or even more. Ever the manipulator, Holmes seemed to tailor his confessions for maximum audience and controversy, enjoying the renewed spotlight even as he awaited his own death. Holmes's execution, carried out on May 7, 1896 at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, was an event fraught with morbid anticipation. Crowds gathered outside, hawkers sold commemorative pamphlets, and every moment of his final day was meticulously recorded. Holmes himself insisted on one last peculiar detail, that his body be buried 10 feet deep in concrete, fearful that his corpse would be exhumed and dissected by ghoulish souvenir hunters, or poetic justice, medical students seeking their own specimens. The request was granted and his grave remained sealed, a final attempt to cheat death's indignities, even as he faced its inescapable judgment. Holmes's trial and execution reverberated across America, the first time many grappled with the modern archetype of the serial killer, the random predator hidden behind a mask of perfect respectability. The tabloid headlines faded, the murder castle was eventually demolished, but the legend of H. Holmes haunted the public's imagination for generations. His trial exposed not just one man's capacity for evil, but the frightening vulnerabilities of a society in flux, the anonymity of city life, the inadequacy of law enforcement, and the darkness that can grow in the cracks between progress and morality. In the waning days of the 19th century, as the embers of the World's Fair died down and Chicago's population began to settle from the fever pitch of years prior, the net began to close quietly around H. Holmes. For nearly a decade, Holmes had operated with stunning impunity, slipping in and out of identities, city blocks, and legal technicalities. His murder castle, situated in the heart of Englewood, had become an unassuming tomb for countless souls. But even the most carefully constructed web cannot go unnoticed forever, especially as the disappearances began to arc beyond misfortune into the realm of the suspicious and the grotesque. It all started unraveling not in Chicago, but far to the east, on a Boston street in 1894, when Holmes was arrested for a simple act of horse theft. The irony could not have been lost on investigators. The man who had gotten away with so many far darker acts was finally apprehended for a crime rooted in desperation rather than brutality. Yet it was this seemingly mundane caper that allowed authorities to begin unwinding the chaotic ledger of Holmes's myriad transgressions. Behind the scenes, a Pinkerton detective agency, America's most dogged private investigators, had begun tracking Holmes in earnest. Suspicion had long dogged his footsteps, particularly after Holmes attempted a convoluted insurance fraud with his longtime associate, Benjamin Petzel. The scheme seemed simple on paper. Fake Petzel's death to claim the insurance, then disappear into the anonymity of America's vastness. But greed and hubris undid them. Rather than a staged death, Holmes murdered Petzel for real. Then, in an even darker turn, he continued traveling with Petzel's wife and children, manipulating and deceiving them while plotting their ultimate fate. With Holmes in custody for horse theft, investigators turned their gaze to the mountain of rumors trailing his movements. Philadelphia authorities soon discovered the remains of Petzel, confirming that the supposed insurance scam had been a cover for murder. With every passing week, more connections emerged, from the vanished Williams sisters to the missing Julia Connor and her daughter, each thread leading inexorably back to the labyrinthine corridors of the murder castle. Meanwhile, the Chicago police launched a painstaking search of Holmes's three-story monument to cruelty. Inside, the walls confessed what silence could not. Hidden rooms filled with stains and strange tools, secret passages leading to nothing but brick, vault doors sealed from the outside, and the lingering metallic tang of old violence. Investigators unearthed charred remains, bones, jewelry, and personal effects, each a chilling testament to the horrors quietly swallowed up by the castle's bricks. Holmes initially denied everything, spinning tales with his characteristic calm and unsettling charm. He claimed innocence, painted himself as a victim of conspiracy, and invented ever more outrageous aliases in an attempt to muddy the investigation. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and various witnesses, former employees, left-behind relatives, jilted creditors, were eager to testify. The prosecution built a case not just around intent and means, but around a pattern of vanishment so pronounced it bordered on the impossible. As news of the investigation spread, the American public became both enthralled and horrified. Newspapers from coast to coast ran lurid headlines, "Chicago's Bluebeard caught at last," and "Castle of Horror yields its dead." Spectators flocked to the trial, desperate for a glimpse of the man whose very name had become synonymous with evil. Courtrooms overflowed, and reporters documented every expression Holmes wore, each confident smile, each denial, each cold assessment of the evidence against him. The trial itself was a spectacle that fused tabloid intrigue with a sense of national reckoning. Holmes faced a battery of charges, ranging from insurance fraud and theft to multiple counts of murder. The Philadelphia case, centered around the murder of Benjamin Petzel and his 3 children, was the most open and shut, with undeniable evidence linking Holmes directly to the crimes. The murders in Chicago, while harder to prove individually due to Holmes's extraordinary skill at erasing evidence, nonetheless formed a chilling, circumstantial mosaic. Holmes, ever the actor, conducted his own defense with a mix of feigned sincerity and chilling detachment. He cross-examined witnesses, proposed alternate theories, and played to the gallery with an unsettling showman's poise. At times he seemed to relish his notoriety, writing confessions and recantations to the newspapers, spinning new tales of victims and collaborators that only further deepened the American public's morbid fascination. Holmes's shifting stories, sometimes confessing to some murders, sometimes claiming innocence, confounded investigators and readers alike. His testimony veered from plausible to fantastical, describing secret societies and shadowy accomplices, but delivering no substantiated proof except his own word. The jury, however, was not so easily beguiled. The overwhelming forensic and witness evidence in the Petzel case, as well as the mountain of circumstantial evidence from the castle, left them little room for doubt. As the verdict was delivered, guilty of murder in the first degree, Holmes's legendary composure finally cracked, just for a moment. He was sentenced to death by hanging, the punishment for his catalogue of horrors at last decided in the stern glare of justice. But Holmes's time in prison was no less sensational than his life on the outside. His cell became a hub for journalists eager to extract confessions or lies masquerading as them from the infamous killer. Holmes, ever the narcissist, obliged with gusto. He penned a memoir detailing his early life and crimes in grandiose, often contradictory fashion, and dictated new stories almost daily. In his final confessions, Holmes claimed upwards of 27 murders, though most investigators believe the true tally could be much higher, with estimates sometimes exceeding 50 or even more. Ever the manipulator, Holmes seemed to tailor his confessions for maximum audience and controversy, enjoying the renewed spotlight even as he awaited his own death. Holmes's execution, carried out on May 7, 1896 at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, was an event fraught with morbid anticipation. Crowds gathered outside, hawkers sold commemorative pamphlets, and every moment of his final day was meticulously recorded. Holmes himself insisted on one last peculiar detail, that his body be buried 10 feet deep in concrete, fearful that his corpse would be exhumed and dissected by ghoulish souvenir hunters or, poetic justice, medical students seeking their own specimens. The request was granted, and his grave remained sealed, a final attempt to cheat death's indignities even as he faced its inescapable judgment. Holmes's trial and execution reverberated across America, the first time many grappled with the modern archetype of the serial killer, the random predator hidden behind a mask of perfect respectability. The tabloid headlines faded, the murder castle was eventually demolished, but the legend of H. Holmes haunted the public's imagination for generations. His trial exposed not just one man's capacity for evil, but the frightening vulnerabilities of a society in flux, the anonymity of city life, the inadequacy of law enforcement, and the darkness that can grow in the cracks between progress and morality. The final days of H. Holmes were shrouded in a peculiar and bone-chilling resolve, a fitting end to a life saturated with deception, ambition, and unimaginable violence. After his conviction for multiple counts of murder, and the mounting suspicion that his true list of victims ranged far beyond what any official ledger could capture, Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging at Philadelphia's Moyamensing Prison in the spring of 1896. Yet even as society demanded justice, Holmes approached his execution with a marked absence of terror or remorse, inviting a shudder through everyone who encountered him in those last months. In the weeks leading up to his hanging, Holmes maintained an almost eerie composure in his jail cell. He gave a handful of interviews to the burgeoning American press, spinning elaborate stories, at times recanting then confessing new crimes in a display that was equal measures performance and manipulation. Journalists described the chill that seemed to pervade the cell block, as if the sheer presence of Holmes warped the very air, his gaze cold, his words cryptically self-possessed, hinting at truths which may never have been known. His memoir, hastily penned in those final days, mixed outright fabrications, paranoid musings, and half-lucid glimpses into the mind of a man who refused to be defined by anyone but himself. Holmes's last requests revealed the same paranoia and detachment that had characterized his life. Terrified of posthumous retribution, perhaps poetic justice for the desecrations he'd inflicted on others, he demanded that his body be buried in a coffin encased in cement, at least 10 feet below ground, to prevent grave robbing or scientific dissection. It was a bitter irony. The man who profited from selling others' remains to medical schools feared the same fate might befall him. On May 7, 1896, a crowd gathered for the execution, a macabre spectacle as newspapers breathlessly chronicled every detail. Holmes faced death without fear, his last words expressing an unnatural calm. As the gallows trap sprung, some witnesses believed they saw a faint smile flicker across his lips. Afterward, his remains were interred under the heavy shroud of cement and secrecy he demanded, as if even in death he hoped to elude justice one last time. Yet more chilling than the execution itself was the legacy Holmes left behind, a sense that American innocence had been forever breached. Almost immediately, newspapers and dime novels seized upon the story, branding Holmes America's first serial killer. The murder castle became the stuff of urban legend. Children whispered ghost stories about the devil in Chicago, and adults struggled to comprehend how such atrocities could have gone undiscovered so long in plain sight. The destruction of Holmes's murder castle in a suspicious fire, shortly after his conviction, only added to the legends. Reporters and curiosity seekers flocked to the charred ruins, desperate to find new evidence or a last horrifying secret left behind. Even in ruins, the building seemed to cast a shadow over Chicago, a reminder that unimaginable evil sometimes wears the most ordinary face. As years passed, the Holmes saga became woven into the fabric of American folklore and cautionary tales. The case sparked heated debates about crime, punishment, and the dark undercurrents running just beneath the surface of the nation's newfound prosperity. For decades, police and amateur sleuths alike pursued rumors of additional victims and secret accomplices. The press recycled old theories and new confessions, while Holmes's own contradictory statements ensured the truth would remain elusive. Holmes's story also had a profound impact on American culture's relationship with fear and fascination. The legal proceedings, press coverage, and public spectacle foreshadowed the true crime obsession that would bloom in the 20th and 21st centuries. In literature, film, and popular imagination, Holmes became a symbol, the archetype of the charming, cunning killer who threatened the dream of urban security. Both his castle and his crimes became settings for countless novels, plays, and even museum exhibits, keeping the terror alive across generations. Beyond the headlines and horror stories, however, Holmes left a subtler legacy, a lasting suspicion of anonymity and unchecked ambition in American life. His ability to exploit the cracks of a rapidly growing city, to disappear victims amid the constant movement of modernity, served as a warning about the perils of progress without vigilance. The Holmes affair prompted reforms in policing, hotel regulations, and forensic investigation, small but significant efforts to ensure that such a monster could never thrive in silence again. Still, the shadow of H. Holmes persists. Nearly every generation rediscovers the story, retelling it with fresh anxieties about trust, vulnerability, and the unthinkable residing just next door. The cold end might have come for Holmes, but the echoes of his crimes continue to haunt America's collective conscience, a chilling reminder of how evil can flourish amid naivety, and how even a concrete tomb cannot seal away all ghosts.